presentation, I'm just going to give you a brief overview of how we go about collecting data for quantitative studies and the different types of data that you can collect. So there are 6 common ways to collect data in educational research, and the Johnson and Christensen chapter explains all of those in more depth, and I think it's a pretty straightforward chapter. So I'm just going to cover really quickly those 6 ways here in this slide, but come to class with questions if any of these aren't clear, because I'm not going to go too much into the depth on them in this presentation. Tests are basically just instruments that are designed to measure knowledge. So for instance, the SAT, the GRE, those are developed by expert psychometricians who have really advanced training typically, and so we're not going to be developing tests as part of this course. I will talk more though about how to develop a questionnaire in another presentation. Those are basically just self-report instruments that you give to your research participants to measure their views, their satisfaction, their behaviors, that kind of thing. So that's a common source of data in action research is through questionnaires. So we will talk more about them in this course. Also, we'll talk more about interviews, which can be, as the chapter talked about, both qualitative and quantitative. So that's when a researcher actually sits down and collects data from participants through a conversation. Focus groups are similar to interviews, but they involve a small group, so several different research participants who respond to prompts from a researcher who's also present. Observations are actually an interesting source of data collection, and that's when researchers actually just observe and watch what people do. So for instance, sitting in the student union and watching how students engage socially with one another in that setting. So the idea is that you're capturing data in a natural setting and trying to observe behavior where it actually takes place, as opposed to asking people about it. Another source of data can be visual data or documents, so photographs, drawings, paintings. And then finally, some researchers can also use secondary data, which is existing data that was collected for another purpose, but then can be used in a research study. And I use secondary data a lot in my research, and I'm happy to talk about examples of any of these in class, so ask me about it. But one thing that I do want to highlight, you can use more than one of these in a single study. Your study just doesn't have to use focus groups, and actually, oftentimes, many studies use multiple sources of data in order to respond to research questions. So that's something, don't feel limited that you have to pick one. You can use multiple sources of data in any given study. So as I said before, each of those methods of data collection, with the exception of tests actually, can collect both qualitative and quantitative data. So here's an example from my dissertation, a document that I used, a page of a yearbook from MIT in the late 60s. So you could use this to answer both qualitative and quantitative research questions. So a qualitative question you could answer using these data. Perhaps you were interested in doing a historical case study. So you were interested in answering the question, maybe, how did women of color experience an elite college during the civil rights era? And using yearbook data, that could help you to describe the experiences of women of color during the civil rights era. Or maybe you're interested in understanding why were MIT students less likely to engage in student protest movements during the 1960s. That would be another qualitative question you could answer using these yearbook data. In terms of quantitative research questions you could look at, so first of all, there's actually a study that's out there that uses yearbooks to study whether or not there's a relationship between physical attractiveness and holding leadership positions as college students. So the researchers actually gave a group of raters yearbook pages, and the raters went through and assigned numbers between 1 and 5 based on how attractive they thought each person was. And then they looked at the relationship between that rating, level of attractiveness, and the types of involvement that the students were part of in the yearbook. Another research question that people have done using yearbook data was whether or not social estrangement predicted mental illness. So some researchers went through high school yearbooks of people who developed schizophrenia as adults, and they looked at They measured this idea of social estrangement as being the absence of extracurricular activities in their yearbook entries, and they actually found that people who developed schizophrenia later in life were less likely to be involved in extracurricular activities as high school students. So yearbooks are actually a fascinating source of research data, both qualitative and quantitative. Okay, so focusing now on quantitative research, an important concept in data collection is measurement. And essentially, measurement is defined as the assignment of numbers to attributes of people, objects, or events according to logically acceptable rules. So thinking about my example from the prior slide, where researchers went through yearbooks and assigned numbers to how they saw people's attractiveness in their pictures, that would be measuring attractiveness, right? Assigning numbers, they used 1 through 5 to try to proxy attractiveness, to measure attractiveness. So the key idea when you're going to measure something is your conceptual definition of a variable and then your operational definition. So the conceptual idea is physical attractiveness, and then the idea is how do you operationalize that? You define it, maybe 1 is totally unattractive and 5 is extremely beautiful. So operationally, we measured physical attractiveness with a scale of 1 through 5. So an example in higher education of that, it can be through the National Survey of Student Engagement. They try to measure a whole different vast array of attributes of college students. And it's an annual survey of first-year students as well as senior students, and it focuses on their participation in educational experiences and how that connects to outcomes that we want students to graduate college with. And so one of the constructs that they're interested in is the idea of higher order learning. So this concept of higher order learning. And they define that by saying that higher order learning is cognitively intense learning that requires much more academic effort and application than simply memorizing facts. So the idea that you're really engaged and involved and understand the concepts that you're exposed to in the classroom. So how does the National Study of Student Engagement go about measuring higher order learning? So how would you measure this idea of cognitively intense learning that requires much more academic effort and application than memorizing facts? You really can't ask students directly, hey, how much do you feel like you've engaged in higher order learning? Because students really have a difficult time, understanding what that conceptual idea is. So Nessie goes about operationalizing it with several different scales. And so they ask students to answer on a scale from 1 to 4, with 1 being very little, 2 being somewhat, 3 being quite a bit, and 4 being very much, how often they engage in these four behaviors during class. So how often did they analyze the basic elements of an idea, experience, or theory, such as examining a particular case or situation in depth and consider its components? And then also these other 4 aspects of what Nessie says people who have regularly engaged in higher order learning should be doing these different activities on a regular basis. So that's how Nessie measures higher order learning. So this is important, the idea between conceptual ideas that we're interested in studying and then how we operationalize and measure those as part of research. Okay, so there are several different types of scales we can use when we're measuring things in a quantitative way. First of all are the type of scales that are referred to as nominal, and essentially those are just assigning numerical values to groups, names, or categories, but there's no ordering of cases that's implied or no sort of real meaning that's given to that number beyond just assigning it to a case. So for example, let's say I'm interested in comparing views of males and females. Maybe I'll say all males are assigned a 1 and females are assigned a 2, just to create that distinction between males and females. Or maybe, I'm interested in studying married people, unmarried people, and widowed people. So I'll give married people a 0, non-married people a 1, and widowed people a 2. I assigned numbers so I can compare those groups, but the numbers are pretty arbitrary, right? I could switch around the numbers and it would really have no bearing on how I view those people in my research. However, ordinal scales, in ordinal scales, your attributes are rank ordered. So although the distances between your attributes might not have any meaning, but there is an order implied. So for instance, maybe you're doing a survey and you're interested in people's highest level of educational attainment. And so you decide to assign a 0 to those who don't have a high school degree, a 1 to those who have a high school degree, a 2 to those who have attended some college, and a 3 to those who have a college degree or more. So in that measure, higher numbers do mean more education, but the distance between having less than a high school degree and a high school degree is not the same as having some college and a college degree, right? So the distance between 0 to 1 is not necessarily the same as 3 to 4. So the interval between those values is not interpretable, but there is some order implied. An interval scale, however, in this case, the measurement, the distance between any two values does have meaning. So a good example is maybe the GRE or the SAT. So a GRE score of maybe 300 compared to a GRE score of 400, that distance of 100 points is the same as if you have a GRE score of 700 compared to a GRE score of 800. So 100 points has meaning in this instance. However, the idea that there's a 0 in that scale is sort of arbitrary, right? So they could scale the GRE however they wanted. Maybe it is scaled from 0 to 800. Or they could do it from, 800 to 1600. It's kind of arbitrary as to where the 0 point is, but still the distance between any given score does make sense, right? Most scales in social science research are on a ratio scale, however, and they do have a meaningful 0 point. So for instance, let's say you're an academic advisor and you count the number of students you see in any given month. So seeing 0 students actually does have a very specific meaning, right? Or seeing, 200 students compared to having 400 students the month before. That also has meaning. So it's the meaning between points is important, as with an interval scale, but also with a ratio scale, a 0 is meaningful. So that's the difference between those two. Okay, let me give you a couple more examples of measurement scales. So from the National Study of Student Engagement that I referred to on the prior slide, here's an item that asks students to respond in terms of how they would evaluate their entire educational experience at their institution. And students are asked to respond according to this scale: excellent, good, fair, or poor. On what scale would that be? So it would be ordinal, right? So these categories have names, as a nominal variable would, but they also have something more. They have an order, right? Like there's an order implied by poor, fair, good, excellent, and vice versa. It's relatively better to have a good experience than a fair experience, right? There's an order implied. So that would be an ordinal scale. What about this item? So students were asked to write in their year of birth. So what would year of birth be? What scale is year of birth? This is a little bit tricky. So it's actually an interval variable, or interval scale, I'm sorry. Year of birth is an interval scale because the interval between the categories of, 1902 and 1903 would be 1 year. And the same is true for 2002 and 2003. That interval is equal to 1 year. So there's equal intervals. But what about a 0 point? So when did time start? Can we imagine an absence of time? So is 0 really meaningful on the scale of years? So even though in philosophy you could probably argue about this, or astronomy we could probably argue about this idea of a 0 point in time, there's really no, in practical terms, a meaningful 0 point. So year of birth is an interval scale, but age, this is kind of tricky, age would be a ratio scale, right? because you can be 1 year old, you can be 22 years old, whatever, and there's an order from youngest to oldest, and the interval between categories is equal, right? 1 year, from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, that's all 1 year, but it's possible to be 0 years old, right? So that would be a ratio scale, because 0 is meaningful in age, but it isn't meaningful in year of birth. So hopefully that makes sense. It's kind of tricky and complicated. And really, in practice, there are very few interval level variables in educational research. Typically, you'll only see ordinal, ratio, and nominal scales, but you still should know the difference between interval and ratio. And so that would be the meaningfulness of 0, a 0 point. What about this final item? So which of the following best describes where you're living now while attending college? A dormitory, local residence, a driving distance residence, a fraternity or sorority house, or none of the above? What scale would those response options be characterized as? So nominal, right? It's kind of obvious since that's the only one left. But each of these categories has names, but whatever number we assign to them can be kind of arbitrary because there's no order implied by those types of residences. So is a fraternity or sorority house better than a dormitory? Some students would say yes, some students would say no, but you can't really assign an order the way you could with all of these other variables like ordinal, interval, and ratio. There's really no order implied by that. So it's a nominal scale. Okay, so knowing the scale of measurement, again, in quantitative research is very important because it helps you decide how to interpret your data as well as what statistical analyses are important or appropriate. For instance, if you have a nominal scale of measurement, you really can't calculate the average on that scale. Think about it. So the nominal example I gave you on the last slide was where students lived, whether or not it was on campus, off campus, in a sorority house, fraternity house, or somewhere else. So if we try to assign or calculate the mean from those response options, it really doesn't give us any information. It's sort of arbitrary because we didn't assign any order to those different categories. So in a lot of times, if you have a nominal variable, you can't calculate a lot of the different statistics that you can use or calculate with data that are collected on other scales. So it's very important to know what your scales of measurement are so that you know what you can do with those data once you collect them. And finally, one thing I want to highlight, so I talked a little bit and you read a little bit about how sampling can create error in your results, but also know that you can, when you're collecting data, there's always some measurement error too. And so random error is really just any factors that randomly affect your measurement. So let's say you're in a bad mood, or it happens to be sunny outside, and so that means you think that your educational experience was excellent rather than just being fair, that kind of thing. But the important thing with random error in measurement is that it doesn't have any consistent effects across the sample. It's just sort of like arbitrary and random. Systematic error, however, are factors that affect the measurement of a variable for everyone in your sample. So oftentimes it's if you word your question in a way that's misleading and everyone interprets how you worded the question differently from what you intended. There are a lot of ways to reduce measurement error, and one important thing is pilot testing. So a lot of times it's good to distribute your sample, or your survey, before you actually do it in practice, maybe to a couple people in your office, and make sure that they all understand what you're asking and that it makes sense to them before you go out and send it out to all of the students that are out there that you're interested in studying. So also another good way to reduce measurement error is to use multiple questions that try to get at the same idea, and then you can compare the responses from each of those questions and see if they're consistent, or if maybe one of your items was worded in a misleading way. And then also certainly when you're entering data, if you have to manually enter it from paper surveys, you want to be really careful when you're entering those data, and then also train people who are collecting data for you well. So this idea of measurement is really important in quantitative research, and there are a lot of different ways that you can try to improve how you measure your data.